debate you indicate, and then we'll let that speaker conclude and then you can come in. So Senator Batchik, go ahead.
I'd like to welcome you to the House, Minister Stanton. It's always a pleasure to have you in here with us, and thank you for your commitment to and interest in the bill, which I understand you won't be opposing, and I'm very glad to hear that. I've been assured of that. I'd also like to thank the many organisations and individuals who have given support to the bill, and I hope we can look forward to support from colleagues from both sides of the House. But I do also want to thank the trade unions that have been hugely supportive and have been campaigning in support of the bill. Impact, SIP2, also the Union of Students in Ireland, USI, the National Women's Council of Ireland and the Irish Second Level Students' Union, all of whom have come out to support this bill. And it is a very important bill. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Gender Pay Gap Information Bill seeks to address a glaring and ongoing inequality in Irish society, an ongoing gender inequality, which is the inequality in pay levels between women and men. We call this the gender pay gap, the term used to describe the difference between the pay of women and men, calculated based on average difference in gross hourly earnings. And in 2013, the EU Commission published a major study on the gender pay gap across EU countries, noting that, on average, women in the EU earn about 16% less than men, and that's an average figure. Now, in fact, there's a very wide range of disparity between women and men across different EU countries. And this disparity remains the case despite the fact that women generally achieve higher level results at college and indeed at school. Indeed, across Europe, women represent 60% of university graduates, yet the impact of the gender pay gap over women's lifetimes mean that they earn less over their careers, have lower pensions and are at greater risk of poverty when they retire. And again, these figures tend to be borne out across international data. So we know that the gender pay gap influences the career paths of women and may shape crucial decisions at each stage of our lives. And of course, gender inequality in earnings will also impact into the future on our capacity to grow old comfortably. So where does Ireland feature in this? Our gender pay gap, according to the EU Commission figures from 2013, is 13.9%, almost 14%. That is that women currently earn around 13.9% less than men. It's not the worst figure in the EU, but nor is it anywhere near the best. It is, I should say, better than the equivalent gap in our nearest neighbour, in Britain, obviously not so much longer to be in the EU, but still the equivalent gap there, the gender pay gap, is 19.5%, a really shocking figure. But the figure of 13.9% still impacts significantly on women's careers and income levels here. And to put it another and perhaps more graphic way, the figure equates to women in full-time employment in Ireland working for free for about 1 month of every year. So I think that perhaps illustrates better than any other figure the real impact of the pay gap on women's lives. And of course we should remember that it's now more than 40 years since at EU level action was taken to address gender pay inequality. We in Ireland introduced our Anti-Discrimination Pay Act in 1974, well over 40 years ago, following the introduction of EU pay equality directives, and yet we're still seeing this persistent gender pay gap. So women have still not achieved anything close to income parity with our male colleagues. Why is this the case? Well, again, a myriad of studies have looked at reasons for this, but looking at the EU Commission's work, they suggest a number of factors. First, of course, there may still be cases where women are subjected to direct discrimination in the workplace and actually paid less per hour than male counterparts doing the same job. But this is less common now because, of course, it is specifically prohibited under both EU and national legislation. However, what we do see are ongoing structural problems, structural barriers to women's pay equality that impact at a less obvious or less overt level on women's pay equality. So, for example, we have a real problem with occupational gender segregation, where women and men are concentrated in different roles and in different sectors. So we know, for example, in the health and social work sector in the EU, women make up 80% of the workforce. And sectors where women are particularly concentrated, therefore, often become feminised, with the work in those sectors becoming undervalued, valued less highly than comparable work in different sectors, predominantly carried out by men. And again, we have multiple examples of this. Thirdly, of course, women tend to bear a disproportionate burden of caring responsibilities in the home, particularly childcare, but also elder care responsibilities compared to male colleagues. This is often referred to, of course, as the phenomenon of the double day. Many of us are very familiar with that when we go home, having to also carry out caring work, caring responsibilities and so on. And thus that means, of course, that women are therefore less likely than men to work as long hours, and that impacts not only on their earning capacity but on their promotional prospects too in many workplaces. And we see more women therefore concentrated in part-time or job-sharing arrangements or part-time employment. And this has a knock-on effect, as I said. It means women are less likely to be promoted into senior management roles or to achieve promotions more generally in the workplace. And again, colleagues working in this area refer to this as the sticky floor. It's not just a glass ceiling. Women tend to be stuck on a sticky floor in many workplaces, and often, don't put themselves forward. We don't put ourselves forward for promotion because we may know it simply won't be compatible with other caring responsibilities. So all these factors impact on differential pay rates for men and women when we average out pay across different sectors. But the results are shocking. If we look in Ireland, we see that a report commissioned by Morgan McKinley last year, 2016, provides a really detailed insight into how the gender pay gap impacts on the Irish labour market. The report found, and it was a study, I should say, of 5,500 professionals, men and women in Ireland, and they found the gender pay gap actually increases along with the educational level attained by women. So again, women achieving better than men at college level, and yet pay gap opening up and actually getting more marked, worse as women and men progress through their careers. So while there was a pay gap of 22% between men and women with no degree, the pay gap increased to an unbelievable 28% for men and women with a PhD. Average earnings of a man with a PhD, €74,000 per annum. For a woman with a PhD, €53,500 per annum. So 28% of a difference in the pay gap. And with an executive MBA, the figure became even more stark. A pay gap of 33% opens up between men and women, both with equal qualifications. And the pay gap similarly widens with years of experience, from a 12% gap when women and men are starting out on their careers, up to with 0 to 5 years experience, through to a 28% pay gap for women and men who have more than 15 years of experience. I should say, Minister, that this is an area I've long had a passionate interest in, women's equality in the workplace. And some years ago, along with colleagues, and in fact funded by the Department of Justice, we conducted an academic survey of women and men in the legal professions called Gender in Justice, which found that, that while women were outnumbering men by a very significant proportion at university level, law degrees, once women and men entered the workforce, we found a gap opening up between women and men in terms of career prospects, in terms of income, and in terms of promotion. So that, when we asked, we did a qualitative survey as well, and the answer that came back from men and women as to why this was so was to do with children. That when women were most likely to be having children in their early to mid-30s, that was the time when we saw a gap opening up, and we saw men's career prospects accelerating and women's falling back. So this is a real issue, and clearly there's a whole range of things that need to be done to tackle it. I should say it's an issue that's been highlighted and remarked upon not only by the trade union sector, by equality advocates in the National Women's Council, but also by major corporations, by the World Economic Forum, which carried out a major report on the global gender gap in 2016, and by multinational corporations like Unilever, which point out that women's underemployment and women's lower income levels have a majorly detrimental effect on world economic growth. So there are very, I suppose, very sound commercial reasons to address the gender pay gap too. And again, the Morgan McKinley report illustrates that. How do we deal with this ongoing inequality? Clearly, there's a whole range of initiatives that need to be taken, and in particular, initiatives to strengthen supports for women returning to work after having children, initiatives to support men taking time off work, paid parental leave, and delighted that we have paid paternity leave at last in Ireland, but a Labour initiative, I should say, but of course one which needs to be expanded upon, whatever your colleagues may claim, Minister, and I know you haven't claimed that. But the initiative of paid parental leave clearly does need to be expanded upon, because most men of my generation, of younger generations, now wish to take on more caring responsibilities outside the home, and we need to ensure the workplace supports are available for them to do so. But there are very key ways also that we need to tackle gender pay inequality. So quite apart from the bigger picture of childcare and parental leave, we need to look at the legislation that other EU countries has introduced, which has proven to be effective in tackling gender pay gaps. And in particular, this is what our bill seeks to do. So it's a carrot, not a big stick, holistic approach. It seeks to empower the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission to administer a pay reporting mechanism, essentially to require companies or organisations with over 50 employees to publish the difference between the rates they pay to men and women employees, effectively to conduct an audit of their pay scales to establish whether a gender pay gap exists. And the reason I say it's a carrot is because it's enabling legislation. It would facilitate the publication of this sort of these figures, and it would therefore enable companies to address what they may not even be aware of, namely that there is in fact a gap between the men and the women whom they employ. In the legislation, we seek to require employers also to publish details of differences, for example, in bonus pay. And the Morgan McKinley report found the bonus gap is as much as 50% between women and men. So there's quite a lot of different levels of pay disparity that need to be addressed. But the key aspect of the bill is really to ensure transparency in pay rates, to ensure, as I say, that we can highlight any gender pay gap that exists. It's simply not enough to hope organisations will volunteer this information, and we know that. But we have seen this very similar type of legislation prove effective in countries, for example, like Belgium, one of the first to introduce it, which now is a pay gap of just under 7% between men and women, so half of ours currently. Iceland, Australia and Germany have introduced similar legislation, and closer to us, again, Britain has recently implemented gender pay gap reporting with new regulations, Minister, as you're probably aware, requiring companies with 250 or more staff to record annually how much they pay men and women. So our legislation, which I should say is also based on a commitment in the current programme for government, our legislation seeks to really implement recommendations from the EU Commission, from Morgan McKinley closer to home, and from a whole range of different international bodies like the World Economic Forum to ensure we have greater transparency in our in pay rates, and to enable companies working with the Equality and Human Rights Commission to address pay disparity where it exists, to draw up action plans to tackle pay disparity, and to begin to close the gender pay gap. I should say the World Economic Forum has estimated it will take up to 170 years before the gap fully closes if we don't do anything. So inaction is no longer desirable. We need to ensure positive action is taken, as we did with gender quotas in the political sphere, and we saw the impact that had on the numbers of women elected at the last election. Thank you, Chair. I would say, Minister, that this important and progressive legislation will also be most effective in tackling the ongoing pay equality between women and men.
Thanks very much, Senator.